She begged a stranger to pretend to be her boyfriend. The man in the expensive suit agreed with a dangerous smile. She had no idea he was a mafia boss, or that asking for 5 minutes would bind her to him forever. Sophie Carter had 3 minutes before her aunt walked through that door with bachelor number 5, and she was absolutely not doing this today. Rain hammered against the cafe windows as she pressed herself against the brick wall outside, phone buzzing with Aunt Margaret's texts. Almost there, sweetheart. He's a dentist. Very successful. Another buzz. His mother and I play bridge together. Sophie groaned. The last setup had been an accountant who spent 2 hours explaining tax brackets. The one before that collected toenail clippings for art projects. She was a lifestyle journalist for Manhattan Weekly, not a character in her aunt's personal romance novel. Through the rain-streaked glass, she spotted Aunt Margaret's pink umbrella bobbing down the sidewalk, a pale man in a beige sweater trailing behind her like a lost puppy. No, no, no. Sophie yanked open the cafe door and slipped inside, water dripping from her red coat. She needed a plan. A bathroom to hide in. A fire exit. A fake emergency. Or a fake boyfriend. Her eyes swept the crowded cafe and landed on him. Window seat. Corner booth. Alone. He was the kind of man who made you forget what you were about to say. Mid-30s, dark hair perfectly styled despite the weather, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her rent. He sat with the stillness of someone who owned whatever room he entered, one hand wrapped around an espresso cup, the other resting on the table. That hand had a scar across the knuckles. Sophie didn't think. She moved. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, sliding into the booth across from him before he could react. "But I need you to be my boyfriend for exactly 5 minutes." The man's dark eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment, Sophie forgot how to breathe. They weren't just brown. They were the kind of dark that held secrets, the kind that had seen things most people only read about in crime novels. One eyebrow arched. "Excuse me?" "Please," Sophie leaned forward, catching a hint of expensive cologne. "My aunt is about to walk in with another terrible setup, and if I have to sit through one more conversation about dental hygiene or tax-deductible llama farms, I'm going to lose my mind." A smile ghosted across his lips. Dangerous. Amused. "Llama farms?" "Don't ask," Sophie glanced toward the door. 30 seconds, maybe. "Look, I know this is insane, but I'm desperate. Just put your arm around me, look possessive, and she'll leave. 5 minutes. Then I'm gone and you never have to see me again." He studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Then, smoothly, he set down his espresso and slid closer along the booth's curved seat. "What's my name?" he asked. Sophie blinked. "What? If I'm your boyfriend, I should have a name." The door chimed. Aunt Margaret's voice carried across the cafe, loud and determined. "There she is." Sophie's heart jumped. The stranger's arm came around her shoulders, warm and solid, and he pulled her against his side with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Call me Victor," he murmured against her temple, his voice like smoke. "And try to look in love with me. That wasn't going to be hard." Sophie. Aunt Margaret appeared at their table, pink umbrella dripping, the dentist hovering awkwardly behind her. "There you are. I've been texting you. This is..." She stopped, taking in the scene. Sophie tucked against a gorgeous stranger, his arm possessive around her shoulders. The intimate way he was looking at her. "Aunt Margaret," Sophie forced brightness into her voice. "What a surprise." You," her aunt's face cycled through confusion, disappointment, and finally, poorly concealed irritation. "You didn't mention you were seeing someone, didn't I?" Sophie felt Victor's thumb trace a small circle on her shoulder, barely a whisper of movement, but it sent electricity down her spine. "It's still pretty new." Victor extended his free hand to Aunt Margaret, his smile polite but dismissive. "Victor Romano. Pleasure to meet Sophie's family." The dentist behind Aunt Margaret shifted uncomfortably, already sensing defeat. "Romano," Aunt Margaret repeated, her tone sharp. She was trying to place him, categorize him, figure out his tax bracket and family connections. I don't believe I know any Romanos. What do you do, Victor? Import-export, he said smoothly, the kind of vague answer that invited no follow-up questions. Keeps me busy. Sophie watched, fascinated, as he handled her aunt with the skill of a diplomat. Every word perfectly measured. Every gesture calculated to seem casual while actually controlling the entire interaction. Who was this guy? Well, Aunt Margaret clutched her umbrella tighter. I suppose we should be going. Richard. She gestured at the forgotten dentist. Perhaps another time. Richard looked relieved. As her aunt marched toward the door, firing off a text that was probably already alerting Sophie's mother to this new development, Sophie let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Victor's arm slipped away from her shoulders, and she immediately missed the weight of it. Thank you, she said, turning to face him. Seriously, you just saved me from 2 hours of tooth talk. Happy to help, but his smile had faded, and he was looking past her, toward a man in a gray jacket who'd been sitting 3 tables away. The man was now standing, phone to his ear, backing toward the exit. Something changed in Victor's expression. Something cold. You should go, he said quietly. Sophie followed his gaze, but the man in the gray jacket was already gone, melting into the rainy sidewalk crowd. When she looked back, Victor was on his feet, buttoning his suit jacket with sharp, precise movements. Wait, I didn't even properly thank you. Can I buy you a coffee? It's the least I. Not necessary, his tone was polite but final. He dropped a $50 bill on the table for a $7 espresso and moved past her. At the door, he paused, glancing back. For just a second, something flickered in those dark eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or warning. Then he was gone, disappearing into the rain like he'd never been there at all. Sophie sat alone in the booth, her heart still racing, replaying the last 5 minutes. The way he'd moved, the way he'd spoken, that scar on his hand, the cold look he'd given the man in the gray jacket. Import-export. Nobody in import-export wore suits like that or moved with that kind of coiled control. Outside, through the rain-streaked window, she watched a black car pull up. Victor slid into the back seat, and the car disappeared into Manhattan traffic. Sophie pulled out her phone and typed into her notes app, 5 minutes with a stranger who felt like forever. She had an article to write. She had no idea she'd just ruined 3 months of Victor Romano's carefully planned investigation. Or that he'd already decided she was going to be a problem. A problem he'd have to watch very, very closely. Victor Romano didn't get distracted. In 20 years of running the most discreet operation in Manhattan, he'd built his reputation on focus, precision, and an almost supernatural ability to predict his enemies' moves 3 steps ahead. Then a woman in a red coat slid into his booth and asked him to be her boyfriend, and Marco Vitelli, the informant he'd spent 3 months cultivating, panicked and ran. Tell me you got something, Victor spoke into his phone as the town car glided through rain-slick streets. Anything. Marco's in the wind, his right-hand man, James Chun, sounded irritated. Saw the girl, thought it was a setup, bolted before I could intercept. 3 months of work gone. Victor watched the city blur past his window. It wasn't a setup. You sure about that? Awfully convenient timing. She was running from her aunt. Victor almost smiled at the absurdity of it. And a dentist. Silence on the other end. Then, boss, did you just say? Run a background check. Full profile. I want to know who she is by tonight. On the girl? Sophie Carter. Lifestyle journalist. Based on the press badge in her bag, Victor had noticed everything in those 5 minutes. The worn leather of her laptop case. The coffee stain on her notebook. The way her hands shook slightly when she asked for help, like she couldn't believe her own audacity. Most people who approached him knew exactly who he was. They came with fear in their eyes and carefully rehearsed words. They wanted something: money, protection, mercy. She'd wanted 5 minutes of his time and looked at him like he was just a man in a nice suit. When was the last time someone had looked at him like that? I'll have it in 2 hours, James said. But boss, if she's a journalist, then we need to know what kind. Victor ended the call. His driver, Paolo, caught his eye in the rearview mirror. The old man had been with Victor since the beginning, back when Victor was 25 and still proving he could hold his father's empire together. Something on your mind, Paolo? That young lady seemed nice. She interrupted a 3-month investigation. She smiled at you like you were human, Paolo said quietly. That doesn't happen often. Victor didn't respond. He didn't need to. Paolo was right, and they both knew it. By the time Victor reached his penthouse office in Tribeca, James was already waiting with a tablet and a grim expression. The office looked like it belonged to a legitimate businessman. Floor-to-ceiling windows, modern art, expensive furniture. Nothing that would suggest the man who worked here controlled half the underground operations in the city. Sophie Marie Carter, 28, James read off the screen. Lifestyle journalist for Manhattan Weekly. Columbia grad. Lives alone in a studio in Brooklyn, rent-controlled. No criminal record, not even a parking ticket. Social media is mostly food pics and terrible jokes. She's interviewing a chocolatier tomorrow for a fluff piece about Valentine's Day trends. Victor took the tablet, scrolling through the photos. Sophie at a food festival, laughing with her mouth full. Sophie attempting yoga in a park, falling over. Sophie holding up a martini with a caption, "If I post a cocktail pic, does it count as work?" She was ordinary, harmless. Exactly the kind of person who should never cross paths with someone like him. Her aunt's been trying to set her up for 2 years, James continued. Parents are retired in Florida. 2 younger brothers. Clean as they come. She's nobody, boss. Nobody doesn't make Marco run. Victor set down the tablet. He's been feeding us information on the Castellano family for months. The moment she sits down, he sees her and bolts. Why? James leaned against the desk. Maybe he's more paranoid than we thought. Or maybe he recognized her from somewhere. Victor pulled up Sophie's social media again, studying her face. No, Marco wouldn't follow lifestyle journalists. Did she post anything about today? Not yet. But knowing journalists, James trailed off meaningfully. Victor's jaw tightened. If Sophie wrote about their encounter, if she described him in any detail, it would undo years of careful anonymity. His power came from being invisible. The ghost boss. The man his enemies couldn't find, couldn't photograph, couldn't pin down. Put someone on her building, Victor said. Discreet. I want to know if anyone else takes an interest. Boss, James straightened, his tone shifting to the one he used when he was about to argue. She's a distraction. Marco's gone because he thinks we're compromised. The Castellano deal is about to go sideways. We don't have time to babysit some random girl who... She's not random, Victor cut him off. She walked into the middle of an operation. That makes her either incredibly unlucky or incredibly well-placed. Until I know which, she's a variable I need to control. She looked at you and saw a guy in a suit. She has no idea who you are. Exactly. Victor turned to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. Which means she's not afraid yet. And that makes her dangerous. James sighed, recognizing the tone that meant the decision was final. You want surveillance on her apartment? Just observation. I want to know if the Castellanos start sniffing around. If Marco talks, if he tells them about the cafe, they might think she's connected to me. Is she? Victor thought about her voice when she'd said please. The way she'd leaned forward, desperate and honest. The genuine gratitude in her eyes when she'd thanked him. No, he said finally. She's not our problem. Yet. But even as he said it, Victor felt something shift in his carefully controlled world. A crack in the foundation. Because for the first time in years, he'd played a role he didn't have to, hadn't needed to, and some part of him had wanted to. 5 minutes with a stranger who'd looked at him and seen possibility instead of danger. James left with instructions Victor knew he'd follow to the letter. Paolo departed for the night, with a knowing look that Victor ignored. Alone in his office, Victor pulled up Sophie's social media one more time. Her last post was from this morning. My aunt's trying to set me up again. Send help. Or wine. Preferably both. He almost smiled. Then he closed the laptop and got back to work. 3 blocks away, Sophie Carter was typing the first draft of an article that would change everything. And in a dark bar across town, Marco Vitelli was making a phone call to the Castellano family, explaining exactly why he'd run from that cafe. The clock was already ticking. Sophie hit publish on Thursday morning and immediately regretted the third cup of coffee she downed. Her editor, Patricia, had loved the piece. Romantic, relatable, perfect for our Valentine's feature. This is exactly what our readers want. The article had taken a week to write. Sophie had rewritten it 4 times, trying to capture those 5 minutes without sounding completely unhinged. She'd titled it, 5 Minutes with a Stranger Who Felt Like Forever. She'd been careful. No names. No identifying details about the cafe. Just the feeling of it, the spontaneity, the thrill, the way a complete stranger had played along with effortless grace. But she'd included the details that made it real. The tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than her car. The scar across his knuckles. The way he'd moved with old-world courtesy, like he'd stepped out of a different era. The darkness in his eyes that held secrets she'd never know. Sometimes fate puts someone in your path for just 5 minutes, she'd written. And somehow, that's enough to remind you that magic still exists in this cynical world. Her phone buzzed. A notification from the Manhattan Weekly website. Then another. Then 20 more. "Oh my God," Sophie whispered. The article was blowing up. By noon, it had 10,000 shares. By 2 o'clock, 30,000. Sophie watched in stunned disbelief as her Instagram filled with messages. Fashion bloggers were posting about #ScarfGuy. Romance readers were tagging their friends. Someone had created a Twitter thread analyzing the 5-minute meet-cute as the ultimate modern love story. Sophie. Patricia appeared at her cubicle, practically vibrating with excitement. "Do you have any idea what's happening? Your piece is trending on 3 platforms. Vogue just reached out asking if they can interview you about modern romance. Are you serious? The website traffic is insane. This is the kind of content that gets people subscribing." Patricia squeezed her shoulder. "You just wrote the most viral article Manhattan Weekly has had in 2 years. Take the rest of the day. Celebrate." Sophie left the office in a daze, checking her phone every 30 seconds. The comments were pouring in. "I need to know if they found each other again. This made me cry. Someone find this man." She felt like she'd struck gold. This was what every journalist dreamed of, content that resonated, that connected, that made people feel something. She had no idea what she'd actually done. Across town, Victor was in a meeting with his accountant when James burst through the door, tablet in hand. "We have a problem." Victor dismissed the accountant with a look. "Show me." James set the tablet on the desk, and Victor read, 5 Minutes with a Stranger Who Felt Like Forever, by Sophie Carter. "I asked him to pretend to be my boyfriend. Just 5 minutes. He didn't hesitate. He slid closer, wrapped his arm around me, and became whoever I needed him to be." Victor's lips twitched. She'd captured it perfectly. The absurdity, the spontaneity, the strange intimacy of those moments. He had this old-world courtesy, like he'd been raised in a different time. When he shook my aunt's hand, I noticed the scar across his knuckles, a jagged line that told a story he'd never share with someone like me. The smile faded. His suit was impeccable, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, the kind of tailoring you only see on men who understand that clothes are armor. "How many people have read this?" Victor asked quietly. 50,000 and climbing. "It's viral." James pulled up the social media metrics. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Everyone's sharing it. She didn't use my name. She didn't have to. James swiped to another screen, a private message board used by the city's underground families. "The Castellanos saw it 2 hours ago. They've already ID'd you from the description. Scar, suit, the cafe, it's enough." Victor read the thread, his jaw tightening with each comment. "That's Romano. Has to be. Same cafe Marco mentioned.
Same day.
Who's the girl? Find out. They think she's connected to you, James said. They think she's your girlfriend. Victor stood, walking to the window. Below, the city moved in organized chaos, everyone pursuing their own interests, unaware of the invisible wars happening in the shadows. Has anyone approached her? Not yet. But there's been a car outside her building since this morning. Dark sedan, 2 men. Not ours. Victor's hands curled into fists. Castellanos. Most likely. They're watching her, trying to figure out if she's an asset or a target. This was exactly what Victor had feared. Sophie had painted a picture vivid enough that his rivals could recognize him, but vague enough that the general public wouldn't. She'd put herself on a map that only dangerous people could read. She has no idea what she's done, Victor said, more to himself than to James. What do you want to do? Victor turned from the window. In his world, problems were solved with precision. Remove the threat, eliminate the variable, maintain control. But Sophie wasn't a threat. She was a journalist who'd written a romantic story about a stranger who'd helped her. She was innocent. And now she was in danger because of him. Get Marcus and Tony. I want them on her building tonight. Victor pulled out his phone.
Discrète surveillance.
If anyone approaches her, I want to know immediately. We're protecting her? James raised an eyebrow. Boss, she's the one who...
She wrote about me.
That means I'm responsible for what happens next. Victor's voice dropped to something colder. And no one touches what's mine. James was smart enough not to point out that Sophie wasn't actually his anything. What about the Castellanos? Let them watch. Let them wonder. Victor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. They think she's my weakness. Let's make them work for it. As James left to coordinate security, Victor read the article one more time. Sometimes fate puts someone in your path for just 5 minutes. And somehow, that's enough. Fate, Victor murmured. Or terrible timing. In Brooklyn, Sophie was celebrating with takeout Thai food and a bottle of wine, completely unaware of the dark sedan parked across the street. Completely unaware that her viral article had just painted a target on her back. And completely unaware that the stranger from the cafe had already decided she needed protection, whether she wanted it or not. The Velvet Room was the kind of club most people walked past without noticing. No sign, no velvet rope, just a black door in the meatpacking district that only opened for people who knew the right knock. Inside, Dominic Castellano sat in a leather booth, surrounded by smoke and low red lighting, reading Sophie's article on his phone for the 3rd time. A journalist, his younger brother, Luca, said from across the table. Writing love stories about our biggest problem. She's not writing about love. Dominic set down his phone, his rings catching the light. She's writing about Romano. Look at the details, the suit, the scar, the way he moves. That's him. Could be anyone. Marco saw them together in that cafe. Same day, same description. It's him. Dominic leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. And she just told the whole world she's involved with him. Lucas signaled for another drink. You think Romano has a girlfriend? He doesn't do relationships. He barely does human. Everyone has a weakness. Dominic pulled up Sophie's Instagram on his phone, scrolling through pictures of her laughing at food festivals, attempting yoga, holding up martinis. Sophie Marie Carter, 28. Lives alone in Brooklyn. Works for Manhattan Weekly. She's nobody. She's Romano's nobody. That makes her the perfect pressure point. Dominic zoomed in on a photo of Sophie at a street fair, sunshine in her hair, completely unaware of how dangerous her life was about to become. We've been trying to get leverage on him for 3 years. Now she's handed it to us. Luca's eyes narrowed. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we watch her. See if Romano takes the bait. If he sends protection, if he shows up personally, we'll know she matters. Dominic's smile turned cold. And if she matters, we can use her. And if she doesn't? If she's just some random girl? Then we'll know Romano's still untouchable. Dominic drained his whiskey. Either way, we learned something valuable. He made a call, brief and efficient. The journalist. I want eyes on her 24/7. Don't approach, just watch. I want to know everyone she talks to, everywhere she goes. Across the table, Luca shook his head. You're playing with fire, Dom. Only way to see if something burns. Sophie noticed the car on her third night home. It was parked across from her building, a dark sedan with tinted windows that hadn't been there before. She'd lived in Brooklyn long enough to know which cars belonged to her neighbors and which ones didn't. This one didn't. Standing at her apartment window with a mug of chamomile tea, she watched the sedan for a full 5 minutes. No one got in or out. The engine wasn't running. It just sat there, dark and silent. You're being paranoid, she muttered, pulling the curtains closed. But the next morning, it was still there. And that evening, when she came home from interviewing a pastry chef in Queens, she could have sworn she saw the same sedan 3 blocks behind her taxi. Sophie stood outside her building, keys in hand, studying the car. Maybe it was just someone's new vehicle. Maybe she was creating drama where none existed because her life had been boring lately and the viral article had made her feel like the main character in a story. Get a grip, Carter, she whispered, heading inside. In her apartment, she locked both deadbolts, something she'd never bothered with before, and found herself checking the window every few minutes. The sedan was still there at midnight. And the next morning, by Friday, Sophie had convinced herself she was losing it. This was New York, cars parked on streets. That's what they did. The fact that this particular car had been in the same spot for 4 days straight didn't mean anything.
Probably.
She texted her friend Rachel, "Am I crazy or is someone watching my building?" Rachel's response came immediately. "Babe, you wrote a viral article. You're probably just hyper-aware. Also, maybe time to cut back on the true crime podcasts." Sophie laughed, but it felt hollow. That night, leaving the office late, she noticed a man in a gray jacket walking 20 feet behind her. He'd been outside the Manhattan Weekly building when she'd left. Now he was behind her on the subway platform. When she got off at her stop, he got off too. Sophie's heart began to race. She walked faster, weaving through the evening crowd, checking over her shoulder every few seconds. The man in the gray jacket maintained his distance, never closer, never farther. By the time she reached her building, she was almost running. Inside, she slammed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. "This is insane," she said to her empty apartment. "You're being ridiculous." But her hands were shaking as she locked the deadbolts. Victor was reviewing shipping manifests when his computer chimed with an encrypted message from James. Castellano chatter. Sophie's name on 3 channels in last 24 hours. They're planning something. Victor's jaw tightened. He pulled up the surveillance feed from Sophie's building, the cameras his men had installed discreetly on Tuesday. The Castellano sedan was still there, and now he could see they'd added a second team on foot patrol. They weren't just watching anymore. They were preparing. His phone buzzed. James calling. "Talk to me." Intercepted a call between Dominic and one of his guys. "They're planning to make contact tomorrow night.
They want to see if you'll react."
They're using her as bait. Victor's voice went cold. "That's the idea. They grab her, see if you come running. If you do, they know she's valuable. If you don't..." "I'm not letting it get that far." Victor was already standing, grabbing his jacket. "Where is she now?"
"Home."
"But boss, she was followed tonight. One of the Castellanos guys tailed her from work." She noticed. Victor felt something dark and protective surge through his chest. Sophie, who wrote about 5-minute magic and posted pictures of failed yoga poses, was being hunted by men who wouldn't hesitate to hurt her. Because of him. Because she'd written an article that made her seem important to him. "I'm going there now." "Victor," James's tone shifted to the one he used when he thought Victor was making a mistake. "If you show up personally, you're confirming everything they suspect. You're telling them she matters. She's a civilian who got caught in our world. That makes her my responsibility. There are other ways to protect her without." "I'm not debating this," Victor ended the call. In the car, Paolo caught his eye in the mirror. The journalists? They're circling. Victor watched the city, lights blur past. I'm not waiting for them to strike. Sophie Carter had asked him to be her boyfriend for 5 minutes. He was about to become her protector for however long it took, whether she understood why or not. Sophie stayed late at the office on purpose. It was irrational, she knew, but her apartment felt too quiet, too exposed with that sedan parked outside and the memory of being followed still fresh in her mind. At least the Manhattan Weekly building had security, bright lights, other people working overtime. By 10 o'clock, even the night editor had left. "You okay, Sophie?" Marcus, the security guard, asked as she gathered her things.
Fine.
Just avoiding laundry, she forced a smile. The subway station was 3 blocks away. Sophie kept her keys between her fingers the way her mother had taught her, phone in her other hand with 911 ready to dial. The street was emptier than usual for a Friday night, most people already tucked into bars and restaurants. She made it 1 block before she noticed the footsteps behind her. "Don't look. Keep walking. It's nothing." But the footsteps matched her pace exactly. When she sped up, they sped up. When she slowed, they slowed. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. She glanced back just once. 2 men. One in the gray jacket she'd seen before. The other taller, wearing all black. They weren't even trying to hide anymore. Panic clawed at her throat. The subway station was 2 blocks ahead, but it suddenly felt like miles. She could see people on the main street, light and movement, but she'd have to cross an intersection to reach them. The footsteps grew closer. Sophie made a split-second decision that would haunt her later. She veered right into an alley between 2 buildings. If she could cut through, she'd come out near a busy restaurant, near people, near safety. The alley was darker than she'd expected, lit only by a single flickering bulb halfway down. Dumpsters lined one side, fire escapes zigzagging up the brick walls. The other end was visible, light, street, safety maybe 50 yards away. She started running. Behind her, the men entered the alley. "Sophie Carter?" One of them called out, his voice echoing off the brick. "We just want to talk." They knew her name. Sophie ran faster, her bag bouncing against her hip, her breath coming in sharp gasps. 30 yards.
20.
Almost there. A third man stepped into the alley entrance ahead of her, blocking her exit. Sophie skidded to a stop, trapped between them. Her back hit the cold brick wall as the 3 men closed in, forming a semicircle around her. "Who are you?" Her voice shook despite her attempt to sound brave. "What do you want?" The man in the gray jacket smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. "Like I said, just want to talk. About your boyfriend." "I don't have a..." The guy from the cafe. Victor Romano, he pulled out his phone, showing her own article on the screen. "You wrote about him. Made him sound real important to you." Sophie's mind raced. "That was just a story. He's not, I don't even know him." "That's not what we heard," the tall one cracked his knuckles. "So here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna come with us, we're gonna make a call, and we're gonna see if Mr. Romano cares enough to come get you." "You're insane." Sophie looked for any escape route, but they had her boxed in.
I'm nobody.
That article was fiction. Romance. I made it up for my column. Then you won't mind coming with us to prove it. The tall one reached for her arm. Tires screamed. A black car flew into the alley entrance behind them, headlights blazing, moving so fast Sophie thought it would hit them. It stopped inches from the men, the sudden glare forcing them to shield their eyes. Car doors opened simultaneously. 3 men emerged, moving with military precision. Sophie recognized the careful coordination, the way they positioned themselves to cut off all exits. These weren't random Good Samaritans. The confrontation lasted maybe 30 seconds. No guns, no dramatic fights like in movies. Just swift, brutal efficiency. The man in the gray jacket swung at one of the newcomers and was on the ground before Sophie even saw the counterstrike. The tall one tried to run and was blocked, subdued, forced to his knees. Within moments, all 3 of Sophie's stalkers were on the ground, hands behind their backs, barely conscious. Then the back door of the car opened, and Victor stepped out. He wore a long black coat that made him look like he'd stepped out of a film noir, his dark hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. But it was his presence that stole Sophie's breath, the way he moved with absolute authority, like he owned the entire city and this alley was just one small piece of his territory. His men parted as he walked past them, his eyes locked on Sophie. "You're hurt," he said, and Sophie realized she'd scraped her palms on the brick wall. Blood dotted her hands. "How?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "How did you find me?" Victor stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the cold fury in his dark eyes. Not directed at her, but at what had almost happened. "You wrote about me," he said simply. "That means I'm responsible for you now." Sophie stared at him, at the men on the ground, at Victor's team, who stood like statues waiting for orders, at the way everyone in this alley except her seemed to understand exactly what was happening. "Who are you?" she asked, though part of her was afraid of the answer. "Someone who should have warned you to be more careful about your romantic articles." Victor's jaw tightened. "These men work for a family that wants to hurt me. They thought you were the way to do it." The pieces clicked into place. The expensive suits. The scar. The way he'd handled her aunt with calculated precision. The import-export answer that invited no questions. "Oh my God," Sophie breathed. "You're not a dentist," Victor finished dryly. "Can you walk?" Yes, but..." "Good. Get in the car," he turned to one of his men. "James, make sure these three understand that touching her again means war." "Already handled, boss." Sophie didn't move, her back still pressed against the brick wall. "I'm not getting in your car. I don't even know you." Victor looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not softness, exactly, but understanding. "You know enough," he said quietly. "You know that 3 men just tried to kidnap you because you wrote about 5 minutes in a cafe. You know that I'm the reason you're in danger." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "And you know that right now, I'm the safest option you have." Sophie looked past him at the men on the ground, then at the empty alley stretching behind her. She thought about her apartment with the sedan parked outside, about the man who'd followed her on the subway, about how utterly unprepared she was for whatever world she'd accidentally stumbled into. Victor extended his hand, palm up. An offer, not a demand. 5 minutes in a cafe changed both our lives, he said. But I can keep you alive. Will you let me? Sophie looked at his hand, at the scar across his knuckles that she described in her article, and realized she'd already made her choice the moment she'd slid into his booth a week ago. She took his hand. Victor's fingers closed around hers, warm and solid and absolutely certain. "Let's get you somewhere safe," he said, guiding her toward the car. As Paolo opened the door, Sophie glanced back one last time at the alley, at the 3 men being loaded into a different vehicle, at the life she'd had an hour ago that suddenly felt very far away. She climbed into Victor Romano's car and let him take her into his world. There was no going back now. Victor's car didn't take Sophie home. Instead, they drove to a Tribeca high-rise where the doorman greeted Victor by name and didn't even blink at Sophie's scraped palms and terrified expression. The elevator required a key card. The penthouse had opened into looked like something from an architecture magazine, floor-to-ceiling windows, modern furniture, art that probably cost more than Sophie's entire college education. "Sit," Victor said, gesturing to a leather couch. "I'll get the first aid kit." Sophie sat because her legs felt like water. She watched him disappear down a hallway, then return with a white medical box, his coat discarded, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that suggested he wasn't just good at giving orders. He knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his with surprising gentleness. "This is going to sting," he warned, dabbing antiseptic on her palms. Sophie winced, but didn't pull away. "You have a first aid kit, just ready." Occupational hazard, his mouth quirked slightly. "I'm in a business where people occasionally get hurt." "Import-export?" Sophie asked pointedly. Victor's dark eyes met hers. "Among other things. Are you going to tell me what other things means?" "Not tonight." He wrapped gauze around her left hand with practiced efficiency. Tonight, you're going to process almost getting kidnapped. Tomorrow, we'll talk about arrangements. Arrangements. Protection.
Security.
Making sure what happened tonight doesn't happen again, he finished bandaging her right hand. You can't go back to your apartment. Not yet. Sophie stood abruptly. Excuse me? That's my home. My life. I have work tomorrow, and work can wait. Your life is worth more than a deadline. Victor stood too, and suddenly the space between them felt very small. Those men weren't trying to scare you, Sophie. They were trying to use you as bait. To get to me. Then maybe you should stay away from me. Her voice cracked slightly. If knowing you is what put me in danger, then. It's too late for that. His voice was firm, but not unkind. You wrote the article. They've already connected you to me. Distance won't make you safer now. It'll just make you easier to grab. Sophie sank back onto the couch, the reality of her situation hitting her like a wave. This is insane. A week ago, my biggest problem was avoiding bad dates. Now I'm… what? A target? Now you're protected. Victor moved to his desk, pulling out his phone. Paolo will drive you to work in the morning. One of my men will stay with you during the day. Another will be outside your building at night until we figure out a better solution. No, Sophie shook her head. I'm not doing this. I'm not having bodyguards follow me around like I'm some kind of… You don't have a choice. The words hung in the air between them, not quite a threat but absolute in their certainty. Sophie stood again, anger replacing fear. You can't just decide how I live my life. I can't. Victor tilted his head slightly, and Sophie saw the man her attackers had feared. 3 men tried to take you tonight. How many do you think will try tomorrow? Next week? The Castellanos won't stop just because I showed up once. The who? The family that wants to hurt me. They think you matter to me, his jaw tightened. And because they think it, they'll keep coming for you until they prove it one way or another. Sophie felt the walls closing in. So I'm just trapped in your world because I wrote a stupid article? Something flickered in Victor's expression, almost like regret. You're trapped because I didn't warn you away when I should have. That makes this my responsibility. The next morning, Sophie met Victor's inner circle in his penthouse office. James Chun, the right-hand man, looked at her like she was a problem to be solved. A blonde woman named Maria, who apparently handled finances, kept checking her phone with obvious impatience. A stocky man called Tony stood by the door, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She's a liability, James said bluntly, not even bothering to pretend Sophie wasn't in the room. Every day she's connected to you, boss. Every day the Castellanos have leverage. She didn't ask to be connected to me, Victor replied from behind his desk, his tone dangerously calm. But she is. And now we're diverting resources to babysit a journalist who almost died because of me. Victor's voice cut like a knife. We're not debating this. Maria looked up from her phone. Actually, there might be an opportunity here. The Castellanos already think she's your girlfriend. What if we lean into that? Use her to send a message? Sophie's stomach dropped. Use me? Publicly, Maria continued, warming to her idea. Events, photos, make it look like you're serious. It could actually strengthen your position, show you're not afraid of. She's not a pawn, Victor stood, and everyone in the room went quiet. Sophie stays under protection until the threat is neutralized. That's the end of the discussion. James opened his mouth to argue, caught Victor's expression, and closed it again. Tony, you'll handle day shift. Marcus takes nights. Paolo drives her to and from work. Victor's tone left no room for negotiation. Any concerns? No one spoke.
Good.
Then we're done here. As the others filed out, Sophie stayed seated, watching Victor organize papers on his desk with methodical precision. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Do what? Defend me.
To them.
I know I'm complicating things. Victor looked up, and for just a moment, she saw past the controlled exterior to something warmer underneath. You asked a stranger for 5 minutes of his time. That's not a crime. What happened after isn't your fault. Then whose fault is it? Mine, he said simply. For being the kind of man whose life makes everyone near him a target. By Wednesday, Sophie's life had become surreal. Paolo drove her to work in a town car that made her coworkers stare. Tony, built like a linebacker, sat in the Manhattan Weekly lobby reading a newspaper but watching every person who walked past her desk. At lunch, when she went to grab a sandwich, he followed 3 steps behind. "This is ridiculous," Sophie muttered, waiting for her turkey on rye. "Boss's orders, ma'am," Tony replied without emotion. "Don't call me ma'am. I'm 28. Yes, ma'am." Sophie wanted to be angry, wanted to resent the invasion of her privacy, the way her independence had been stripped away with a few words from Victor Romano. But when she left the office that evening and saw the black SUV waiting, saw Tony scan the street with professional vigilance before opening her door, she felt something she hadn't felt since that night in the alley. Safe. And that scared her almost as much as the danger did. Because getting used to Victor's protection meant getting used to Victor's world. And Sophie was starting to realize that might not be entirely terrible, even if she'd never admit it out loud. Sophie couldn't help herself. She was a journalist, and Victor Romano was the biggest mystery she'd ever encountered. Late Thursday night, after Tony had dropped her off and she'd triple-checked her locks, Sophie opened her laptop and started digging. Google search, Victor Romano, New York. Results, a real estate agent in Queens. An Italian restaurant owner in the Bronx. A high school football player from 2019. Nothing that matched her Victor. She tried variations. Victor Romano Business Manhattan.
Victor Romano Import-Export. Victor Romano Tribeca.
Nothing. It was like he didn't exist in any official capacity. Which, Sophie realized with a chill, was probably intentional. She switched tactics, remembering her journalism professor's words. When the front door's locked, try the windows. Sophie navigated to Reddit, searching true crime forums and New York City underground threads. She typed carefully, Manhattan Ghost Boss Romano. The first 3 results were useless speculation. The 4th made her breath catch. There's a guy in Manhattan, nobody knows his face, but everyone in certain circles knows his name. They call him the Ghost. Runs half the operations below 14th Street without a single arrest.
Some say he's a myth.
I think he's very, very real. Sophie's fingers flew across the keyboard, diving deeper. She found a true crime blog from 2 years ago titled New York's Invisible Empire. The post was mostly speculation, but buried in the comments was a name, Victor Romano. My cousin works security at a Tribeca building. Says Romano lives there. Never causes trouble, always polite, tips well at Christmas. But when certain people show up to visit him, everyone makes themselves scarce. You learn not to ask questions. Another forum, this one discussing organized crime families. The old bosses operated with flash, expensive restaurants, public displays. Romano's different. He's surgical.
Clean.
You don't see him coming until it's already done. The Castellanos have been trying to identify his network for years. They might as well be chasing smoke. Sophie sat back, her tea going cold on the desk beside her. The man who'd bandaged her hands with such gentleness controlled half of Manhattan's underworld. The man who'd made sure she had a driver wasn't just wealthy, he was powerful in ways that existed entirely outside the law. She thought about the alley. The way his men had moved with military precision. The way even James, who clearly disagreed with protecting her, had fallen silent when Victor made his decision final. This wasn't a man. This was a force. Sophie clicked on image search, filtering for Victor Romano Manhattan organized crime. Most results were irrelevant. But then she found it, a blurred photo from what looked like a security camera. The figure was in profile, wearing a dark coat, walking into a building. The quality was terrible, but Sophie recognized the set of his shoulders, the way he moved with that careful control. The caption read, Alleged photo of Romano, 2023. Unconfirmed. Even in a grainy surveillance image, he looked dangerous. Sophie's phone buzzed, making her jump. A text from an unknown number. It's late. You should be sleeping, not researching things that will give you nightmares. Her heart stopped. She looked at the text, then at her laptop screen still showing the blurred photo of Victor. Another text. Yes, I know what you're looking at. I know everything that happens on a screen connected to my protection details network. Sophie typed back with shaking fingers. You're monitoring me? The response came immediately. I'm keeping you safe. There's a difference. That's creepy. That's practical. The Castellanos have hackers too. If they found you searching for information about me, they'd know you're more than just a random journalist. Sophie stared at her phone. Anger and something else. Curiosity? Fascination. Warring inside her. Who are you, really? She typed. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared. Someone who wishes he'd stayed home that day instead of going to a cafe. Sophie's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then, do you regret helping me?
No.
I regret that helping you put you in danger. She didn't know what to say to that, so she typed something safer. Your men call you boss. They call me a lot of things. The internet calls you a ghost. Longer pause this time. Then, the internet talks too much.
Are you?
What they say you are. What do they say? Sophie looked at her screen, at the forums and blogs and whispered accusations. Dangerous. Connected. Someone who operates outside the law. Would it change anything if I said yes? Sophie thought about that. About the fact that she was in her apartment, safe because Victor had put guards outside. About how he defended her to his team, how he'd bandaged her hands, how he'd looked at her in that alley with something that might have been fear in his eyes. I don't know, she typed honestly. Fair enough.
Go to sleep, Sophie.
Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I'm a journalist. We don't believe in unsolved mysteries. I'm a ghost. We don't believe in exposure. Despite everything, Sophie smiled. Is that a threat? That's a request.
Trust me enough to stop digging.
At least for tonight. Sophie looked at her laptop, at all the tabs still open, at the breadcrumb trail of research she'd compiled. Every instinct she had as a journalist screamed at her to keep going, to find the truth, to expose the story. But another part of her, the part that had trusted him in that cafe, that had taken his hand in the alley, whispered that maybe some truths were better discovered slowly. Good night, Victor. Good night, Sophie. Lock your windows. She checked. They were already locked. Over the next few days, Sophie became hyper-aware of Victor in ways she hadn't been before. When Paolo opened the car door, she noticed the way he scanned the street with the efficiency of someone trained in combat, not just driving. When Tony sat in the lobby at work, she saw how other people gave him space, how even her most gossipy coworkers stopped talking when he was nearby. At the coffee shop, when a man bumped into her and apologized, she caught Tony's hand moving to his waist, where she now realized he probably kept a weapon. These weren't just bodyguards. These were soldiers. And Victor was their general. Sophie found herself watching for him, wondering when he'd appear again. 3 days had passed since the alley, and she'd only communicated with him through texts, practical updates about her schedule, his terse confirmations that her security was in place. But she could feel him in every detail of her protected life. The way no one suspicious came near her building anymore. The way Paolo somehow always knew her schedule before she mentioned it. The way she'd found a new phone on her desk at work with a note, more secure. Victor Romano was invisible, but his presence was everywhere. And Sophie was beginning to understand that being protected by a ghost meant living in a world of shadows. The question was, how long before she got used to the dark? The invitation came on Saturday morning, delivered by Paolo along with a garment bag. Mr. Romano requests the pleasure of your company at the Riverside Gala tonight, Paolo said with a slight smile, as if he knew exactly how Sophie would react. 7 o'clock. He'll pick you up at 6:30. Sophie stared at the elegant envelope in her hand. He requests? or he demands. With Mr. Romano, there's not much difference. Paolo set the garment bag on her couch. But he did say to tell you it's important. For your safety. After Paolo left, Sophie unzipped the bag and found a dress that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent. Midnight blue silk that shimmered like water, elegant and understated and absolutely perfect. She should say no. Should tell Victor Romano that she wasn't a prop in whatever game he was playing with his rivals. Instead, she found herself texting, "What kind of gala?" His response, "The kind where being seen with me sends a message. Safer for you if everyone thinks you matter to me." And do I matter to you? 3 disappeared, appeared again. Finally, get ready. We'll talk in the car. Victor looked like he'd stepped out of a classic film. Black tuxedo perfectly tailored, his dark hair styled back, a watch that caught the light as he extended his hand to help Sophie into the town car. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and Sophie felt heat rise to her cheeks. "You look like you're going to intimidate people for fun." His mouth quirked. That's half the point. In the car, Victor's demeanor shifted to something more serious. "Tonight, we're making a statement. The Castellanos will be there. Half of Manhattan's underground will be watching. They need to believe you're important to me."
Why?
"Won't that make me more of a target?" The opposite. Victor's dark eyes met hers. "Right now, you're a question mark. Are you connected to me or not? That uncertainty makes you vulnerable. But if I publicly claim you, if I show that touching you means war with me, they'll back off. The risk becomes too high." Sophie absorbed this. "So, I'm going from interesting possibility to declared territory. Essentially. And you're okay with that? Making people think we're together?" Victor's gaze didn't waver. "I'm okay with whatever keeps you breathing." The Riverside Gala was held in a historic mansion overlooking the Hudson, the kind of venue that whispered old money and older secrets. Sophie had covered events like this before, usually from the press pool, taking notes on who wore what and who was seen with whom. Walking in on Victor Romano's arm was an entirely different experience. Every head turned. Conversations paused. Sophie felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing her, calculating, wondering who she was and why Victor Romano, the ghost who never appeared at public events, had brought her. "Breathe," Victor murmured, his hand steady at the small of her back. "You're doing fine." He introduced her to a parade of influential people, a real estate mogul, a city councilman, a woman who owned half the art galleries in Chelsea. Victor was magnetic in a way Sophie hadn't fully appreciated before, charming without being warm, commanding attention without seeming to demand it. And he never left her side. "So you're the journalist," said a silver-haired man in an expensive suit, shaking Sophie's hand with a grip just slightly too tight. "I read your article. Quite romantic." "Thank you," Sophie smiled politely, but something in the man's eyes set her nerves on edge. "Victor, you didn't mention you were seeing anyone," the man continued, his tone friendly, but his gaze sharp. "Keeping secrets from old friends?" "Sophie's not a secret, Dominic." Victor's voice remained pleasant, but Sophie felt the tension in his hand against her back. "She's private. There's a difference."
Dominique Castellano.
Sophie recognized the name from her research, from the whispers and forums. The rival boss who wanted Victor's territory. Of course, Dominic turned his smile on Sophie, and it didn't reach his eyes. It must be exciting, dating someone like Victor. All that mystery. All those late-night business meetings, he leaned in conspiratorially. "You ever worry about what he does when you're not around?" "Dominic," Victor's tone carried a warning. "I'm just making conversation," Dominic straightened, but his smile had teeth. "It's dangerous out there, Miss Carter. Beautiful young journalists getting followed home, strange men lurking outside buildings. Makes you think about who can really keep you safe, doesn't it?" Sophie's blood ran cold. He was threatening her. Right here, in the middle of a crowded gala, with a champagne glass in his hand and that pleasant smile on his face. She felt Victor's hand slide from her back to her waist, pulling her fractionally closer. "Sophie is perfectly safe," Victor said, his voice dropping to something darker. Anyone who thinks otherwise will discover exactly how motivated I am to prove them wrong. The two men stared at each other, a silent war happening in the space between them. Around them, conversations continued, glasses clinked, but Sophie felt like she and Victor were standing in the eye of a storm. Finally, Dominic laughed, breaking the tension. Good to know, old friend. Good to know, he nodded to Sophie. Lovely to meet you, Miss Carter. I'm sure we'll see each other again. As he walked away, Sophie released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Let's sit, Victor said quietly, guiding her toward their table. Dinner was a blur of courses Sophie barely tasted. She was hyper-aware of Victor beside her, the way he monitored the room while maintaining casual conversation with the people at their table. The way his shoulder touched hers. The way he'd occasionally lean in to murmur context about who someone was, his breath warm against her ear. When Dominic appeared at the podium for a speech about charitable giving, Sophie felt Victor's hand find hers under the table. Not aggressive, not possessive, just steady and warm, his fingers intertwining with hers. Grounding her. He's testing me, Victor murmured, so quietly only she could hear. Trying to see if I'll react. If you really matter. Sophie's thumb traced over the scar on his knuckles, the one she described in her article. And do I? Victor turned his head, and suddenly his face was very close to hers, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. What do you think? He asked softly. Sophie thought about the past week. The protection he'd arranged, the way he defended her to his team, the late-night texts, the dress he'd chosen that fit perfectly. The way he was holding her hand right now, his thumb moving in small circles against her palm. I think, she whispered, this stopped being an act somewhere between the cafe and the alley. Victor's expression shifted, surprise, maybe, or recognition. For me, it stopped being an act the moment you asked for 5 minutes. Around them, people applauded Dominic's speech. The orchestra began playing. Couples moved toward the dance floor. But Sophie and Victor sat still, hands clasped under the table, the truth settling between them like something fragile and dangerous and completely inevitable. Dance with me, Victor said, standing and pulling her gently to her feet. On the dance floor, with his hand on her waist and her hand in his, they moved together like they'd done this 100 times before. Like those 5 minutes in the cafe had been the beginning of something that neither of them had planned, but both of them were starting to need. I know what you are, Sophie said quietly, looking up at him. What you really do. I know you know. Victor's grip tightened slightly. Are you afraid? Terrified, she admitted. But not of you. Then of what? Sophie met his dark eyes and told him the truth. Of how much I don't want this to be fake. Victor pulled her closer, his cheek against her temple, and Sophie felt him smile against her hair. Then let's stop pretending, he murmured, echoing the words she'd written in her article. And in that moment, under the chandeliers with danger circling them and Victor's rivals watching from the shadows, Sophie Carter fell for the ghost in the expensive suit.
Completely.
Irrevocably. Dangerously. Sophie's phone buzzed Tuesday afternoon while she was reviewing a draft article about Brooklyn bakeries. A message from an unknown number appeared on her screen. I have information about Victor Romano. The real story. The one everyone's afraid to tell. Sophie's finger hovered over the delete button. After everything, the gala, the protection, the way Victor had held her while they danced, she should ignore this. Forward it to James. Tell Victor immediately. But then another message came through. You're a journalist, aren't you? Don't you want the truth? Or are you too far under his control already? Sophie bristled at that. Yes, she was involved with Victor now. Yes, she'd stopped digging after he'd asked. But she wasn't under his control. She'd made a choice to trust him, not surrender her independence. A third message. I worked for him. I know things. Things you should know before you get in too deep. Meet me at the old Fulton Fish Market warehouse. Pier 17. 6 p.m. Come alone or I disappear. Sophie stared at her phone. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was suspicious.
Too convenient.
too perfectly designed to appeal to her journalist instincts. But what if it was real? What if there was someone who actually wanted to talk, to give her the context she'd been missing? She thought about the forums, the whispered stories, the gaps in Victor's past. He'd told her what he was, but not who he was. Not really. Why should I trust you? Sophie typed back. You shouldn't. But if you want answers, this is your only chance. 6 p.m. Alone. Sophie checked the time. 4:47 p.m. She looked across the office, where Tony sat reading his newspaper, her ever-present shadow. If she told him, he'd shut this down immediately. Call Victor. Lock her down. And she'd never know if this was real. Sophie grabbed her coat and bag, walking casually toward the elevator. Tony looked up, starting to rise. Just need to grab something from the pharmacy downstairs, Sophie said with what she hoped was a convincing smile. 2 minutes. The building's secure, right? Tony hesitated, then nodded. Make it quick. Sophie took the elevator down, heart pounding. In the lobby, she didn't go to the pharmacy. She went straight through the revolving door and into the street, flagging down the first taxi she saw. Pier 17, please.
Fast.
As the taxi pulled away, Sophie saw Tony burst through the building doors, phone already to his ear. She felt a stab of guilt but pushed it away. She just wanted answers. She'd be careful. In and out. 30 minutes, tops. Victor was reviewing shipping manifests when his phone erupted with calls. James first. We lost her. Victor's hand tightened on the phone. Explain. Tony called. She went downstairs, said she was hitting the pharmacy, then bolted. He's tracking her phone now. Victor was already moving, grabbing his coat. Where is she? Heading toward the waterfront. Boss, this feels wrong. Trace her messages. Last hour, Victor's mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. Someone contacted her. He heard James typing furiously. Got it. Unknown number, 3 messages sent at 4:45 p.m. She deleted them, but they're in the backup. Someone's offering her information about you. Wants to meet at the old Fulton Market warehouse. Victor's blood ran cold. The warehouse district. Abandoned buildings. Perfect for an ambush. How long ago did she leave? 15 minutes. Get Marcus and Tony. Meet me there. Now, Victor was already in the elevator, Paolo waiting with the car. And James? Tell them to bring weapons. The Castellanos just played their hand. In the car, Victor pulled up the tracking app on his phone, watching Sophie's location move steadily toward the waterfront. Toward the trap they'd laid for her. He'd been so careful. Protection, surveillance, making sure she was never alone. And she'd walked away from it all because someone offered her a story. Faster, Victor told Paolo, though they were already pushing every speed limit. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number, but Victor recognized the sender. Dominic Castellano. Curious little thing, your girlfriend. A real journalist to the end. Let's see if you care enough to come get her. Victor typed back with deadly calm. Touch her, and I burn your entire operation to the ground. Then I guess you'd better hurry. Sophie's taxi pulled up to Pier 17 as the sun started to set, casting long shadows across the abandoned warehouse district. The area had once been bustling with fishermen and merchants. Now it was mostly empty, scheduled for redevelopment that kept getting delayed. Sophie paid the driver and stepped out, immediately regretting her choice. The street was deserted. Broken windows gaped like empty eyes. The warehouse loomed ahead, its metal sliding doors rusted and partially open. Her phone buzzed. Another message, inside. 3rd floor. Red door. Sophie's hands trembled as she typed. I'm here. Where are you? No response. She should leave. Call Tony. Call Victor. Admit she'd made a stupid, impulsive mistake driven by pride and curiosity. But she'd come this far. Sophie stepped through the warehouse entrance, the musty smell of old fish and decay hitting her immediately. Inside was darker than she'd expected, the setting sun barely penetrating the grimy windows. Metal stairs led upward, creaking under her feet. Hello. Her voice echoed in the empty space.
I'm Sophie Carter.
You said you had information. No answer. Second floor. Third floor. A red door at the end of a corridor, exactly as promised. Sophie's journalist instincts were now screaming alongside her survival instincts. This was wrong. This was a setup. This was... The door behind her slammed shut. Sophie spun around. 3 men emerged from the shadows, and she recognized one. The tall man from the alley, his face still bruised from where Victor's team had subdued him. Thanks for coming, Miss Carter, he said with a cruel smile. Real professional of you. Sophie backed away, her phone clutched in her hand. I'm just here for information. I'm not. You're here because you're predictable. Another man stepped forward, blocking the red door. Journalists. Always chasing the story. Always thinking they're smarter than they are. Sophie tried to dial, but the tall man was faster, snatching the phone from her hand and throwing it against the wall. It shattered. Mr. Castellano wants to have a conversation with your boyfriend, the man said. You're just the invitation. The reality crashed over Sophie like ice water. There was no informant. No inside source. Just bait in a trap, and she'd walked right into it. Because she'd thought she was clever enough, independent enough, journalist enough to handle this on her own. Victor's going to find me, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. We're counting on it, the man smiled. That's the whole point. Sophie looked around the abandoned floor, at the men closing in, at her shattered phone on the concrete. She'd wanted answers about Victor's world. Now she was about to learn exactly how dangerous it could be. The tall man circled Sophie like a predator, his phone in hand. Let's call your boyfriend, shall we? Oh wait, we smashed your phone. Guess we'll have to use mine. Sophie pressed her back against the cold concrete wall, searching for any escape route. 3 men between her and the door. Windows too high to reach. The red door behind her was locked. She'd already tried. He's going to kill you, Sophie said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. You know that, right? Victor will. Victor will what? The man laughed. Come storming in like some action hero? The ghost doesn't get his hands dirty, sweetheart. He sends people. That's what bosses do. He dialed a number, putting it on speaker. It rang twice before Victor's voice answered, cold as winter. Dominic. Not quite. But I work for him, the man smiled at Sophie. We've got something that belongs to you. Pretty little journalist. Not very smart, though. Walked right in when we dangled a story in front of her. Silence on the other end. Then, if you've hurt her, relax.
She's fine.
For now, the man's grip tightened on the phone. But that depends on you. We want to talk terms. You've been expanding into territory that isn't yours. Time to negotiate. Let me talk to her. The man held the phone toward Sophie. Go ahead. Tell him you're okay. Sophie's throat tightened.
Victor, I'm sorry.
I thought. Are you hurt? His voice was controlled, but Sophie heard something underneath it.
Fear. Rage. Both. No.
I'm okay. But... The man pulled the phone back.
See?
All good. Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to come here alone, and we're going to have a conversation about redistricting territory. You bring your crew, she pays for it. I'll be there in 10 minutes. The line went dead. The tall man grinned at his companions.
Told you.
Threaten the girlfriend. The ghost becomes predictable. He looked at Sophie. Must be nice having someone care that much. Too bad it's going to get him killed. Sophie's mind raced. Victor was walking into a trap because of her. Because she'd been stupid and proud and thought she could handle this world on her own. He won't come alone, she said. You don't know him. We know enough. He's been untouchable because nobody could find his weakness. The man leaned closer. Turns out it's you. 8 minutes later, Sophie heard it. The sound of cars outside. Multiple engines. Doors slamming. The men exchanged glances, suddenly less confident. Then footsteps on the stairs.
Steady.
Purposeful. Not running, not sneaking. Just coming. The warehouse door exploded inward with a crash that echoed through the entire building. Victor stood in the doorway backlit by the setting sun, and Sophie barely recognized him. This wasn't the man who'd bandaged her hands or danced with her at the gala. This was the ghost. The legend. The man who controlled half of Manhattan's underworld through sheer force of will and carefully applied violence. He wore all black, his coat billowing slightly as he moved forward. Behind him, James and 5 others fanned out with the precision of a military unit. But it was Victor who commanded the space, Victor who made the 3 men in front of Sophie suddenly look very small and very aware they'd miscalculated. Gentlemen, Victor's voice was quiet, almost conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying. You have something of mine. The tall man recovered first, pulling a gun and pressing it to Sophie's head. Stay back. He didn't finish the sentence. Victor moved faster than Sophie had ever seen anyone move. One moment, he was 10 feet away. The next, he had the man's wrist in his hand, twisting it with surgical precision. The gun clattered to the floor. The man screamed. You'll what? Victor asked softly, his voice like silk over steel. Threaten her? You did that when you brought her here. Hurt her? That ship sailed the moment you touched her phone. He released the man's wrist with a sharp movement that left him cradling his arm against his chest and turned to the other 2. They'd drawn weapons, but Victor's team already had them surrounded, outgunned, outmaneuvered. Put them down, James said, his own weapon steady. Or don't. I really don't care which. The men's guns hit the floor. Victor walked past them like they didn't exist, his entire focus on Sophie. She was shaking against the wall, trying to process what had just happened, how quickly Victor had dismantled the threat. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Victor shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was still warm from his body, smelling like his cologne and something darker, danger, power, protection all wrapped into one. You're okay, he said, and it wasn't a question. His hands cupped her face, tilting it toward the light, checking for injuries. Did they hurt you?
No.
They just, Victor, I'm so sorry. I thought. Don't, his jaw tightened. We'll talk later. He turned to James, his expression shifting back to cold command. Get them out of here. I want Dominic to understand exactly what happens when he touches what's mine. Make it clear. Make it painful. Make it memorable. With pleasure, boss. As James and the others hauled the men away, the tall one still whimpering about his wrist, Victor turned back to Sophie. The fury drained from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. You almost gave them what they wanted, he said softly, pulling her against his chest. His heart was racing beneath her ear, his arms tight around her.
You.
Sophie pressed her face into his shirt, feeling tears threaten. I'm sorry. I just wanted answers. I wanted to prove I could still be me, still be independent. I didn't think. You didn't think they'd use your best qualities against you. Victor's hand stroked through her hair, the gesture at odds with the controlled violence he'd displayed moments before. Your curiosity, your courage, your need for the truth. They knew exactly what bait to dangle. I was so stupid. You were human, he pulled back just enough to look at her, his dark eyes intense. And that terrifies me more than any threat from the Castellanos. Because I can protect you from them. But I can't protect you from yourself. Sophie looked up at him. At this man who'd just dismantled 3 armed men without breaking a sweat, who'd walked into a trap knowing it was a trap because she was in danger, who was holding her now like she was something precious and breakable. I saw you, she whispered. Really saw you. What you can do. What you are. And Victor's expression was carefully neutral, but she heard the question underneath. Does it change things? Sophie thought about the precision of his movements, the cold command in his voice, the way his men followed him without hesitation. She thought about the violence that lived in him, controlled but undeniably there. Then she thought about the way he'd checked her for injuries first, the way his heart was still racing. The way he'd wrapped her in his coat to keep her warm. Yes, she said honestly. It changes things. Victor's arms loosened slightly, preparing for her to pull away. It makes me understand, Sophie continued, why everyone fears you. And why I don't. His eyes searched hers. You should. Maybe. Sophie's hand found his, the one with the scar, and held it tight. But I don't. I'm afraid of this world, Victor. I'm afraid of the danger. But you? She squeezed his hand. You're the only thing in all of this that feels safe. Victor exhaled, something in him finally releasing. He pulled her close again, his lips brushing her forehead. Let's go home, he said quietly. The real conversation comes later. But as he led her out of the warehouse, his arm around her shoulders and his team surrounding them, Sophie realized something. She'd seen Victor Romano at his most dangerous. And she'd fallen even harder. Victor's penthouse felt different when they returned. Safer somehow, but also more confining. Like stepping from one world into another, leaving the chaos and danger at the door. James disappeared after a quiet conversation with Victor. Paolo left with instructions Sophie didn't hear. Suddenly, it was just the two of them, standing in that enormous living room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan's glittering lights. Sophie set down the glass of water Victor had given her, her hands finally steady. I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Victor stood by the window, still wearing black from the rescue, looking every inch the dangerous man she'd seen at the warehouse. You might not want all of it. I don't care what I want. I need to know what I'm involved in. Sophie's voice was firm despite the tremor underneath. No more vague answers. No more import-export. Who are you, really? Victor turned to face her, and something in his expression shifted. Walls coming down, defenses lowering. You already know who I am. You researched it. I know what the internet says. I want to hear it from you. He was silent for a long moment, then moved to the liquor cabinet, pouring 2 glasses of scotch. He handed one to Sophie, then sat in the chair across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. I run operations that exist outside the law, he said plainly. Money laundering, protection services, logistics for people who can't use legitimate channels. My father built the network. I inherited it when I was 25, after he was killed by the same people I just threatened over you. Sophie sipped her scotch, the burn grounding her. The Castellanos. Their predecessors. Same family, different generation. Victor's jaw tightened. I could have walked away. Sold everything, disappeared. But I didn't. I rebuilt the operation smarter, cleaner, invisible. I became the ghost because ghosts don't get killed. And the people who work for you. James has been with me since the beginning. Paolo was my father's driver, stayed out of loyalty. The others, most of them came from bad situations. I gave them structure, purpose, protection. In return, they give me loyalty. He met her eyes. I'm not going to tell you I'm a good man, Sophie. I've made decisions that would horrify you. I've hurt people who threatened what's mine. I operate in shadows because that's where I'm most effective. Do you kill people? Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor didn't look away. I've given orders that resulted in deaths. Yes. The truth sat between them, heavy and undeniable. Sophie should be running. Should be calling the police. Should be doing anything except sitting here, drinking scotch with a man who just admitted to being exactly what the forums whispered about. Why did you tell me? She asked. You could have lied. Because you deserve to know who you're choosing. Victor set down his glass. And because I'm done pretending with you. Sophie absorbed this. The gala. That wasn't pretend, was it? No, Victor's voice softened. That was me realizing I'd crossed a line I'd never meant to cross. I don't do relationships, Sophie. They're vulnerabilities. Weaknesses. Exactly what happened tonight, people using someone I care about to get to me. It's why I've stayed alone for 10 years. But you slid into that booth and looked at me like I was human. Victor stood, moving to the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. Sophie joined him at the window, standing close enough to see the tension in his shoulders. What happens now? Now you make a choice. Victor turned to face her, his expression serious. I can protect you for the rest of your life. I'll erase every trace of your connection to me. New identity, new city, new start. The Castellanos will think you're gone, and you'll be safe. You can go back to writing about bakeries and bad dates and have the normal life you deserve. And if I don't want that. Victor's hand came up, cupping her face with devastating gentleness. Then you stay. And this world, my world, becomes yours. The danger never fully goes away. There will always be rivals, threats, moments where being with me puts you at risk. Your life will never be simple again. You'll always have to look over your shoulder. Always have to wonder if someone's following you for real or if it's just paranoia. Sophie leaned into his touch, her heart pounding. That's not exactly a selling point. I know. His thumb traced her cheekbone. Which is why I'm giving you the choice. Walk away, Sophie. Be smart. Be safe. Is that what you want? What I want doesn't matter. Yes, it does. Sophie's hand covered his, holding it against her face. Tell me what you want. Victor's carefully controlled expression cracked, showing her the truth underneath. I want you to stay. I want to be selfish enough to keep you in my world, knowing it's dangerous. I want to fall asleep with you in my arms and wake up knowing you chose this, chose me, despite everything I am. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. But I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, Sophie said softly. I'm choosing. Victor pulled back slightly, searching her face. You don't have to decide now.
Take time.
Think about. I already decided. Sophie stepped closer, closing the distance between them. I decided the moment I asked you to be my boyfriend for 5 minutes in that cafe. I just didn't know it yet. Sophie. You told me at the warehouse that you can't protect me from myself. That my curiosity and courage could be used against me. Sophie's hand found a scarred one, the one she'd written about, the one that had become familiar. But those same qualities are what made me ask a dangerous stranger for help. What made me write that article. What brought me into your world.
Exactly.
And look where that got you. It got me here. Sophie squeezed his hand. With you. And yes, I was terrified tonight. Yes, I saw what you're capable of. Yes, I understand this world is dangerous and complicated and nothing like the life I planned. She looked up at him, her voice steady. But I also saw you walk into a trap because I was in danger. I saw you check me for injuries before you even dealt with the threat. I saw you scared, Victor. For me. That's not. Let me finish. Sophie took a breath. At the gala, I told you I didn't want this to be fake. You said, then let's stop pretending, but I think we've both been pretending that this is just about protection. That it's just about keeping me safe from the Castellanos. Victor's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. So, I'm making my choice, Sophie continued. I'm choosing the man who wrapped me in his coat. The man who holds my hand under tables. The man who becomes terrifying when I'm threatened and gentle when I'm hurt. I'm choosing you, Victor. All of you. The ghost and the man. Victor's forehead rested against hers, his eyes closed. You're going to regret this. Maybe, Sophie admitted. But I'd regret walking away more. Your life will never be normal. Normal is overrated. I tried normal. Normal was boring dentists and bad dates. Victor's laugh was soft and surprised. This is insane. So, was asking a stranger to pretend to be my boyfriend. Sophie's hand slid to the back of his neck. I'm apparently very good at insane decisions that work out. Victor opened his eyes, and Sophie saw everything in them. Fear and hope and something deeper, something that looked like the beginning of forever. If you stay, he said quietly, you're mine. I'll protect you, keep you safe, give you everything I have. But I'll also be possessive and controlling and probably drive you crazy with security protocols. I can live with that. And if the Castellanos or anyone else comes after you again, I will burn their entire world down. Sophie smiled. I'm definitely okay with that. Victor kissed her then, finally, his hands in her hair and her arms around his neck, and it felt like every moment since that cafe had been leading to this. to choosing each other despite the danger, to admitting that 5 minutes had become something neither of them could walk away from. When they broke apart, Victor rested his forehead against hers again. "No more running into danger on your own," he murmured. "No more keeping secrets to protect me," Sophie countered.
Deal.
And in that moment, standing in his penthouse overlooking the city that held both promise and threat, Sophie Carter chose her future. A future that would never be simple, but would always be with him. 6 weeks later, Sophie sat at her desk at Manhattan Weekly, reviewing her latest column. The headline read, "Love in Unexpected Places, When Strangers Become Everything." "Sometimes the universe puts someone in your path when you least expect it," she'd written. "And if you're brave enough to say yes to the possibility, your whole world changes." It was vague enough to be romantic, specific enough to make her smile. Patricia had loved it, calling it your best work yet. Sophie's viral article about the 5-minute boyfriend had turned into a series, romantic observations about modern love that readers devoured. She just left out the parts about mafia bosses and warehouse rescues. "Ready." Tony appeared at her cubicle, and Sophie smiled at how normal this had become. The intimidating bodyguard who now knew her coffee order and occasionally made terrible dad jokes. Just finishing up. Her life had transformed in ways both obvious and subtle. She still lived in her Brooklyn apartment, though Victor had quietly upgraded her locks, added security cameras, and somehow convinced her landlord to install bulletproof glass. She still wrote her articles, still met sources for interviews, still lived her life. But Paolo drove her to work. Tony shadowed her during the day. And every evening, she went home to Victor. Not to his penthouse, though she stayed there some nights, but to the life they were building together, piece by careful piece. "Boss is waiting," Tony said, and Sophie grabbed her bag. The town car was parked outside, and Victor stood beside it, looking impossibly handsome in a navy suit, checking his phone. When he saw her, his expression softened in that way it only did for her. "How was your day?" he asked, pulling her close for a kiss that made Tony politely look away. "Productive." Finished the column. Interviewed a pastry chef who makes sculptures out of croissants. "Dangerous work," Victor said dryly, and Sophie laughed. "Someone has to do it." In the car, Victor's hand found hers automatically, their fingers intertwining like they'd been doing this for years instead of weeks. James had stopped calling her a liability. Maria had actually smiled at her last week. The inner circle had accepted what Victor had known from the beginning. Sophie wasn't going anywhere. "Where are we going?" Sophie asked, noticing they weren't heading to either of their apartments. "You'll see." 10 minutes later, the car pulled up to the cafe. Their cafe. The place where everything had started on a rainy afternoon that felt like a lifetime ago. Victor led her inside, and Sophie's breath caught. The same booth by the window where she'd slid in uninvited, desperate to escape her aunt. But now there were flowers on the table, simple, elegant roses, and 2 espressos waiting. "You're sentimental," Sophie teased as they slid into the booth, sitting on the same side this time, his arm around her shoulders. "I'm practical," Victor corrected. "This is where you became mine." Seemed appropriate to come back. Sophie leaned into him, watching the city move past the window. People rushing home from work, couples walking hand in hand, a woman with a pink umbrella, though thankfully not her aunt. "Can you believe all this started with 5 minutes?" she asked softly. Victor's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining, his thumb tracing over her knuckles. He turned to look at her, and Sophie saw everything in his dark eyes. The man who'd played along with her desperate request, the ghost who'd rescued her from danger, the person who'd given her a choice and respected it. "Best 5 minutes of my life," he said quietly. Sophie smiled, reaching up to touch his face. "Even though I ruined your investigation? Especially because of that." Marco turned informant anyway. The Castellanos backed off after I made my position clear. His expression turned serious. "And I got you. You got a stubborn journalist who walks into traps. I got the woman who looked at me and saw possibility instead of danger." Victor kissed her forehead. I got the person who chose me, knowing exactly what I am. The ghost and the man, Sophie murmured. Always both. For you. They sat in comfortable silence, drinking their espressos, watching the world outside. Sophie thought about how scared she'd been that afternoon, running from another bad setup. How she'd taken a chance on a stranger with dark eyes and a scarred hand. How 5 minutes of improvised courage had led to this, to safety and danger intertwined, to a love that existed in shadows, but felt more real than anything she'd ever known. I have something for you, Victor said, pulling a small box from his jacket. Sophie's heart jumped. Victor, relax. It's not what you think. Not yet. He opened it to reveal a key on a simple silver chain. Key to the penthouse. So you can come and go as you please. No more waiting for me to let you in. Sophie took the key, feeling the weight of what it represented. Not just access to a building, but complete entry into his world.
Trust. Partnership.
Forever. Does this mean I have to start attending more galas? She asked. Only if you want to. Victor's smile was genuine, transforming his usually controlled expression into something warm. Though you do look incredible in formal wear. Flattery will get you everywhere. I'm counting on it. Sophie clasped the chain around her neck, the key settling against her heart. She thought about her article from that morning, about strangers becoming everything, about brave choices and transformed worlds. You know what's funny? She said. I spent years avoiding my aunt's setups, running from the wrong guys, looking for something real. And I found it by asking a dangerous stranger to fake it. Sophie laughed. My mother would die if she knew. Your mother thinks I'm in international consulting, Victor reminded her. Let's keep it that way.
Deal.
They finished their espressos as the sun set over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The cafe filled with evening customers, but Sophie and Victor stayed in their booth, wrapped in their own world. The fake boyfriend who'd become her protector. The journalist who'd become his weakness and his strength. The 5 minutes that had become forever. Ready to go home? Victor asked eventually. Sophie looked at him, at the man who'd walked into a trap for her, who'd given her a choice, who'd made space in his dangerous world for her stubborn independence, and smiled. With you? Always. They left the cafe hand in hand, stepping into a future that would never be simple, never be safe, never be normal, but would always be theirs. And as Victor opened the car door, as Sophie slid in with his coat draped over her shoulders against the evening chill, as Paolo pulled into traffic with Tony riding shotgun and the city lights beginning to sparkle, Sophie realized something. She'd asked for 5 minutes. Victor had given her forever. And she'd never been happier in her life.